Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Layla Zadeh, and I'm the Executive Director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group. I'm delighted to be here today chairing this panel on discretion or concealment, which is a topic I know of very big interest to anybody who's working on how LGBTQI plus asylum claims are determined. I'm just going to go through some practical remarks at the beginning. So we will start this session with a 15-minute presentation from each of our three speakers, after which we will have a question and answers. But please do feel free to ask questions as we go along using the Q&A box, which you should find at the bottom of your screen, and then we will read some out at the end. I apologize in advance if we don't have time to get through all of the questions. Now, just to introduce our panelists today, first, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jana Wessels. Jana is Assistant Professor of Migration Law at the Amsterdam Center for Migration and Refugee Law at Free University Amsterdam. For her doctoral research, she explored the concealment controversy in refugee law doctrine. A monograph based on her dissertation will be published with Cambridge University Press in 2020. Following Jana, I'm very pleased that we will have Dr. Petra Sussner, who is a postdoc researcher at Humboldt University, Berlin. She finished her PhD on reception conditions, refugee status, and the LGBTIQ spectrum, to be published in 2020. Beyond that, she spent research visits at the Amsterdam Center for Migration and Refugee Law and used to practice as a lawyer in Vienna. And finally, I'm also happy to have Bojana Asanovic here, who is the chair of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, UK LGIG. So we are in fact both from the same organization, but I am chairing this session as in an independent capacity. Bojana is the author of Still Falling Short, UK LGIG's 2018 research report. Bojana is also a barrister at Lamb Building. And so with that, I would like to hand over to Jana, please.
Yeah, thank you, Layla. So I'll share my screen. Right. Not sure if it's in presentation mode now, but I'll just go ahead. So, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks, Layla, for the introductions. So we have now a panel on discretion reasoning in refugee status determination or refugee status decision making. And we thought together that it would make sense that I briefly set out what that is. So discretion reasoning is the idea that a claim for international protection can be rejected on the basis that the claimant behave discreetly in their country of origin. So the reasons for persecution are not necessarily immediately visible, and many of them need to be expressed in one way or another so that the persecutor can even discern them and identify them to be that characteristic. And that raises then the question of whether the claimant has to contribute in their own protection by hiding the characteristic, or if that is not possible, by at least exercising some restraint. Now, that idea has been rejected in a series of judgments and high-level judgments. The most important or most notable ones are the 2010 UK Supreme Court decision in HJ Iran and HT Cameroon that rejected a requirement to be discreet so that claimants cannot be returned to their countries of origin on the basis that they would hide, that they must hide, I should say. And then that was followed by two decisions of the CJEU, the Court of Justice of the European Union. They are confusingly called YNZ and XYNZ in 2012 and 13 on religion and sexual orientation. And there too, the Luxembourg court rejected the possibility for using the argument that the claimant has to be discreet in order to, and therefore they cannot receive protection. So we have those judgments, and we have the argument that kind of reasoning is not in line with the idea of refugee protection. So why is there even, it was rejected. So why is there even a panel now? Why do we have this panel on discretion? And the reason that we do is that we found that in spite of these rejections, discretion reasoning is still prevalent in decision making in different ways and in different countries. And I think the three of us will now reflect on this fact in different ways and try to explain it from different perspectives and approaches. And I will start by zooming in on refugee law doctrine and the refugee definition. And I basically want to make a simple point. I want to suggest that discretion is built into the refugee definition because it emerges from three different tensions that are interrelated and sort of emerge from the refugee definition. The first such tension is the tension between what I call the fundamentality principle and the severity argument. And that is based on the tension between the convention ground and persecution, and that again sort of refers back to the tension between the focus on the claimant and the persecutor. And I will try to briefly go through each of these in turn. So I want to suggest that the reason that we cannot get rid of discretion is the fact that we have two competing notions in refugee law doctrine that everyone holds on to, but that clash. So one of those notions is what I call the fundamentality principle. And that is the idea that refugee law protects people who are persecuted for particular characteristics, which are considered to be so fundamental to human identity that one should not be compelled to hide, change, or renounce them in order to avoid persecution. That makes sense. If it were required to hide, then we would never need refugee protection, because then the persecutor wouldn't persecute, and then we would be done with the entire story. But then there is another basic notion of refugee law, and that is that refugee law provides surrogate protection only for serious violations of core or basic human rights, rather than a worldwide guarantee of freedoms, and that claimants can therefore not expect to be able to live as freely and openly as they could in the country of asylum. So refugee protection is for very serious situations, right? So the problem, and that also seems to make sense, but the problem is both these notions clash. So the idea, not the same freedoms as the severity argument would require, requires some measure of hiding. However, no hiding requires the same freedoms. So we have a clash here in two of the notions that everyone subscribes to, and they clash. And that means that everyone kind of needs to prioritize one over the other in specific situations. So why do we have these two sort of competing notions and everyone holds on to them? And I think that is because the Refugee Convention has a double rationale, which in itself is also to a certain extent paradoxical. So the convention protects convention grounds, it provides protection of the convention grounds and from persecution. And then the question is the main motivation of refugee law to be seen in the protection of the convention grounds, given that persecution for other reasons is not protected? Or is the protection from persecution the main rationale, given that other harms on the basis of the convention grounds are not protected. Now, both are laid out in the definition as necessary conditions, and that creates also a dilemma in situations of conflict. And then we prioritize one over the other, and that leads to different scopes of protection, to different understandings of what we think is protected under the refugee definition. And that refers to the third tension. Whether we prioritize the idea that the convention grounds are protected and should not be hidden, the fundamentality principle, or the fact that the aim of the convention is to protect from persecution and the severity argument, has consequences for the way in which we assess particular situations, particularly situated claimants. This is because, and this is where it gets a little bit messy, but this is because the question of whether a person belongs to a group, or the protected group, can be established in different ways, and that's also refugee law provides for that. So it can be either that the person is actually a member in the sense that they self-identify as a member of that group, in this case that they self-identify as gay, then the convention ground could be given. But protection also extends to those situations where the persecutor only perceives someone to be a member of that group, only imputes group membership. In that case, the person doesn't even self-identify and sort of doesn't actually belong to the group. And those two elements can come together in different ways. Those two approaches to establishing group membership, and the consequences that we draw from those are differently sort of shaped scopes of protection. So, in cases where both the claimant self-identifies as gay and has been outed, or the persecutor also thinks that they are gay, they are the more or less straightforward cases in the sense that, at least from the perspective of discretion reasoning, those cases can still raise many issues related to often disbelief and credibility. We have, I think, 3 panels on credibility at this conference alone, so there's still many difficult questions around those kinds of claims, but they are not so complicated from the perspective of discretion reasoning. Those who are not gay, who do not self-identify as gay, and also have not been imputed to be gay, are also relatively straightforward in the sense that they would most likely not receive protection because there's nothing to protect. But the complicated cases are those that are the ones I highlighted in yellow. So in some cases, a person may self-identify as gay, but not have been outed yet. So the persecutor does not know about this. Does this mean that this person would receive protection? And the answer to this question sort of is influenced by the way we position ourselves on the question of whether we prioritize the severity argument and persecution or the fundamentality concern and the convention ground. So if someone is gay but has not been outed, the answer could be classical discretion reasoning. Well, just don't tell the persecutor, and then you don't have a problem, and you're fine. You would, and that can be rejected on the basis of the understanding that the convention serves to protect fundamental characteristics. The other situation is where a person is not gay or does not self-identify as gay, but has been imputed, or for some reason the persecutor thinks that they are gay or belong to the persecuted group, which can be another group as well. In that case, that can lead to a version of discretion reasoning in situations where the fundamentality concern is prioritized, in the sense that in this case there is nothing to protect because the person isn't gay, they can be returned, maybe go to a different part of the country and denounce and then they will not face persecution. So the question, or the tension that is built into the definition of refugee from the Refugee Convention, between the fundamentality principle and the severity concern, and the question of whether it's all about the convention ground or persecution, comes into a different sort of interplay, and leads to complicated questions that have real outcomes in terms of what we understand the scope of protection to be. And discretion really comes into play and covers the space beyond the boundaries of protection that we draw up on the basis of how we position ourselves in relation to these tensions. And I think that much of the confusion around discretion reasoning is really due to the fact that we haven't conceptualized the convention grounds and their role in the definition to a sufficient degree in order to understand these tensions and interrelations. Much unlike, because the focus has so much been on persecution in the discussions. Right, I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to hearing what the others will say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. That was really interesting, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure for many of us, including myself, there was a lot of new ideas or new concepts to take in, so thank you. Okay, I would like to move on now to Dr. Petra Susana, who is going to give, I'm sure, an equally fascinating presentation, but from a different perspective. Okay, Petra, over to you, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you as well. So here we go. Now let me close this. And I need the full screen mode. Here we go. So, okay. We have a basic agreement on this panel. And this basic agreement is that discretion reasoning keeps popping up again and again. And Jana has now talked about how this actually alludes to bigger debates or a bigger picture of the refugee definition. And I would like to draw your attention to a different scheme or pattern that I see here by raising a question. My question is, why at this particular point? Why are we discussing discretion reasoning exactly when it comes to LGBTIQ people? Why doesn't, for example, Jana has mentioned religion. Why doesn't the German idea of a religious internal forum keeps coming back after the Luxembourg court has rejected it? Why aren't we fighting over the question whether the political dissident should they be a little more discreet, maybe? Like, for example, print their flyers in the cellar, tweet anonymously about how to conspire against a government. We aren't doing that. We're discussing here at this point. And I think there is a reason for that. And the reason is it's perfectly normal. Homosexuality is a private matter, right? It's something that, a private agenda that you pursue at home in your bedroom. So it's probably perfectly fine that I ask you to keep it this way, right? This thinking of homosexuality as a private matter is not only very stereotypical and common. Historically, it's not even a repressive or excluding thought. It's actually a goal. It's about a human rights goal. And we all remember, of course, the European Court of Human Rights decision in Jeff Dutch and we UK. decades ago, where the court ruled that homosexual acts are protected by the right to privacy. So, and criminalizing them is not justifiable. This was a huge goal. This was a game changer. And now we have a problem with this game changer, because this game changer is, and now here comes my main argument, it's heteronormative. And using the term heteronormativity, I of course refer to a system that is thinking in binary terms, that is thinking in terms that there are only two genders, cis women and cis men, and that they are structured in a model that is hierarchical and that's heterosexual. Of course, it works, it is intertwined with other power dimensions such as racism, ableism, you name it, and recreates privilege and exclusion within heteronormativity. And I think that heteronormativity, and this is my main argument, is a specific problem and a special problem within asylum law. Why? Because it actually transgresses the binary of the country of origin, the danger, the persecution, and the country of residence, where people are supposed to be protected. Heteronormativity is the logic that is underlying persecution, and therefore it can't be the logic that we use when it is about protecting people from this very persecution. This has to be a failure, and we can observe this failure on various areas. We can observe it when reception centers fail to protect people, and it's highly dangerous for a lot of LGBTIQ people to live in reception centers that think in binary gender terms or in heterosexual normativity. We also see it, of course, in the area of stereotypical reasoning. And yeah, Karin Hugendubel has mentioned the Austrian case from 2018, where the Austrian authorities considered a gay man to be too girly to be true. This is, of course, a heteronormative stereotype, a twisted one. And we see it, and I'm going to talk about that now, we see it within discretion reasoning. And we have already seen it in the way that I have been talking about discretion reasoning up to now. I have been talking about homosexuality. And I know that lots of people argue that actually discretion is not an issue within the area of trans, inter, or non-binary claims. I'm not so sure about that. I know and I have seen trans and inter people who pass whether they want or not. And I've seen trans and inter asylum seekers passing. Yet it is true that the authorities do not use discretion reasoning in these cases usually, but I think it's not because discretion is not an option anymore, but because they are mainly still busy mixing up sexuality and gender identity, which is again a very heteronormative thing, because in that case it's about visibility and invisibility of trans, inter, and non-binary people. We also see discretion reasoning in everyday case law. For my PhD, I have analyzed cases from Austria between 2014 and 2019. So after XYZ up to nearly today. And yeah, it's important to know that the Supreme Court in Austria, it has rejected discretion reasoning in 2014 with explicit reference to X, Y, and Z. And there are a few cases since then, a few cases that directly refer to the discretion requirement and still are persisting. The vast majority of cases, and there are lots of them, use discretion reasoning probably by accident because it's very normal. And I refer to them as indirect discretion reasoning. Namely, I have identified 4 different constellations that actually foster discretion reasoning. And the first is alternative reasoning. It's called in German, it's eine Wahrunterstellung. If I translate it directly, it's a truth assumption. It works like the decision, basically a claim is rejected because it's not credible, but the decision also says even if we were to believe this claim, still it would not fall under the refugee definition because, and there we find lots, strikingly many tacit assumptions that people would be discreet in the country of their origin because nobody knows about their sexuality and so forth. Second constellation is a mathematical approach, especially after XYZ. It seems to be tempting to work with statistics of convictions. Actually, in Austria, this is violating case law principles, just to work on the quantitative basis and to work with numbers of convictions. Still, it happens, and we have a striking problem here. Of course, there are no convictions as long as everybody is hiding. And lots of decisions work on that assumption, not assessing what would maybe happen if people would start to live openly, gay, trans, inter, bisexual, whatever. We, of course, have the famous example of the internal flight alternative. Other people have written about that. It also builds on the assumption that people would act discreetly many, many times, and they could live in another part of their country of origin on that basis. And we have a fourth constellation, which is actually an exception, but it has some tradition in Austria, and the Fleeing Homophobia report already mentioned it. It's the idea that bisexual people, for example, can be safe in their country of origin because there's only heterosexuality and homosexuality. And of course they can, or they are expected only to act on their heterosexual part of their identity. Now let me finish with an example of how such a, I have this just a second because I cannot read it. To do it this way, of how such an indirect discretion reasoning can look like, and probably it's quite familiar for many of you. It's a decision from 2017. Even if one believes his claim, one can assume that there is an internal relocation alternative. Since there is no functioning registration system in Nigeria, one can assume that his persecutors will not be able to locate him in another part of the country. Moreover, no one will endanger him because of his sexual orientation, since nothing is known in another part of Nigeria about the events with the foster father. And the events with the foster father were basically the foster father finding out about the relationship of the claimant with his partner, another man. So basically the decision is expecting this claimant to be, I don't know, never act on sexual orientation ever again, or to hide in the future. So what to do about, and I'm going to change into full screen mode again now. Here we go. Yeah. Sorry. Here we go. My last question is what to do now. My main argument is discretion reasoning happens because it's perfectly normal to think in that way. And I think it's actually supported by the case law situation that we have. We know that from ABC as well. In XYZ, the European Court of Justice has just told us what not to do. But we don't know what we should actually do. There are a lot of open questions. For example, what to do if people choose the closet. Living openly is maybe a right, we do not know that exactly, but it's definitely not a duty. So how to decide on that basis? Or another question, is there actually a right to live openly, like HJ suggests? What is the basis for that right? Can people invoke this right, or are people who decide actually only obliged not to expect discretion? So a lot of open questions, and to avoid to tap into the discretion trap, Meanwhile, I suggest to get rid of perfectly normal first. Try to, and I have, in the beginning, I've said we have this striking problem that heteronormativity transgresses the binary of the country of origin and the country of residence, but we can also use that. If we name, address, and see heteronormativity as a problem and the underlying logic of persecution, it's more obvious that we cannot use the system of heteronormativity to protect people. So how, and I think we have various possibilities to do that. How to do that in the area of discretion reasoning. My simple yet radical suggestion is starting with the idea of a right to live openly as an LGBTIQ person. Just the idea of a right. We don't have to find solutions for how to categorize this right now. It's just about assessing the case. And starting with this idea without using heteronormative stereotypes such as living openly is only about, I don't know, having sex on the streets. Maybe it is sometimes, but usually it's about going out and being able to talk about who you love, being able to go out and wear high heels even though you have facial hair, being able to go to the doctor as an interperson without being in danger of having non-consensual medical treatment. This is the basic idea of having a right to live openly. Based on that, I suggest to just regularly assess the case. How would this applicant express their SOGI in the country of origin? Would there be well-founded fear of being persecuted? And then maybe an applicant wishes to partially hide SOGI. And of course, there's only also the HJ question of the motive. And I have my thoughts on that. But Bojana is going to talk a lot about HG and HT afterwards, and maybe we can discuss it then after her input. So I just suggest, if really applicants know about the idea of the right to live openly, and they still say, I choose the closet, then we still have two questions left if we work with the idea of a right to live openly. First, is there a real risk of being outed? Jenny Milbank already said there is there's no such a thing as a lifelong closet. And I've mentioned interpeople and the danger of just seeing a doctor and being outed. Of course, LGBTIQ people can be outed at various occasions. So I think the well-founded fear test has to include this question: is there a real risk of being outed? And that's actually something Hathaway and Popjoy suggested in 2012 in the article Queer Cases Make Bad Law. Does the closet itself constitute persecution? It's possible that living in a closet actually creates a situation that's connected to mental health suffering. And to really assess a case based on the idea of a right to live openly has to ask this question as well. And finally, let me conclude with a very recent case from Austria where the Supreme Court used heterosexuality as a social norm, so a structural thinking, to reject discretion reasoning. And I found it very interesting. It was one of the persisting cases. The court had rejected, the Federal Administrative Court had rejected a claim twice. The first time, a man from Iraq who had been living with his partner over years secretly. First time, the claim was rejected because the applicant had stated that they were living happily with their partner in Iraq. So they said, if you were happy, where's the problem? Supreme Court squashed the decision and said, no, you have to assess what would have happened if they had lived openly. And the second time, the application was rejected because the Federal Administrative Court ruled that actually in Iraq, everybody heterosexual as well as homosexual people have to be discreet about their sexuality. And then this was the decision of the Supreme Court, and I find it highly interesting. Supreme Court ruled that this is a violation of discrimination, that it's racist discrimination actually. And the court ruled the relevant prohibition of discrimination thus intends to ensure that people with same-sex orientation, especially in societies in which heterosexual relationships are seen as the social norm, are treated in the same way as heterosexual people and are not forced to keep their sexual orientation secret. So what do we see? The Constitutional Court actually rejected discretion reasoning using societal structures, referring to them, and stepping back from a heteronormative idea that expressing sexuality is only about having sex on the street. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you very much. And if you want to contact me, please do so.
Thank you so much, Petra. That was really fascinating, and I think very interesting to see the issue of discretion from the two different angles, from Jana's dissection of the refugee definition and then your analysis of heteronormativity. So thank you very much. I'd like to now pass on to Bojana, who I believe is going to give examples from the UK, and in particular HJ Iran, which has been mentioned already in the presentations. Thank you, Bojana.
Thank you very much. After two preeminent speakers' detailed analysis of issues, mine is going to focus on a practitioner's perspective and also look at HJ Iran and Euclid's analysis of how it should be applied. And perhaps give some examples about how it shouldn't be applied. I am relying on Moira to share my presentation.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Bojana. I'm having problems because I can't seem to record and share the screen at the same time. Hang on, I'm just going to try. Oh, maybe this is it. Sorry about this. Okay, can people see that?
Yep.
Okay, I'll get that started now. There we go.
Right, that screen, right. Thank you very much, Moira, and thank you to all participants for bearing with this. So I am here under the flag of UK LGIG, and I will, for those of you who don't know the organisation, just mention who we are. Next, please, Moira. We're a small organisation that has been around for very many years now and is focused on supporting LGBTQI people through the asylum and immigration process. We focus on asylum, and we provide, or our team of support workers provide practical and emotional support to LGBTQI asylum seekers, and also we offer legal information and advice, and led by Leila, we also advocate for improved policies in decision-making in LGBTQI+ claims. Now, next, please. Euclid has published 3 research reports on decision-making by the UK Home Office. They captured mostly qualitatively, the nature of decision making by the Home Office, looking at the issues that were thrown up at different times. And the first one was in April 2010, failing the grade, which was at a time, next please, when UK legal landscape was such that it was practically prohibitive to the vast majority of asylum seekers making claims on sexual orientation basis to succeed, because the learning of the time was that the risk of ill treatment in the countries of origin would not amount to persecution, where it could be removed by the claimant acting discreetly on return, if this was reasonably tolerable to them. At that time, some 56% of cases relied on that discretion reasoning. The Home Office relied on them, but it was extremely difficult to succeed on appeal, and some 98 to 99% SOGI claims were refused by the Home Office. That all changed. Next, please. When AJ Iran and HC Cameron was decided, it is now just 10 years ago, this was a case that concerned two gay men, and it ruled that a claimant cannot be expected to conceal their sexual orientation to avoid persecution, and that this was contrary to the Refugee Convention. The point made in AJ Iran and HC Cameron very powerfully is that discretion as such is a shorthand. It is really about lying and concealment. It is about a series of steps that one needs to take. That was a case of sexual orientation, and it was about concealing sexual orientation so as to completely deceive one's persecutory environment about one's identity. So it's not simply about not being very loud about who you are, it is about concealment. UCLIC published a paper about applying AJ Iran and HC Cameron to asylum claims based on sexual orientation in June 2018, in an effort to explain how this test in practice should be applied, remaining faithful to the judgment and showing that a discipline with applying the four-step test should, in most cases, or vast majority of cases, produce protective results. Next, please. So the four steps identified were, first, is it reasonably likely that the claimant is gay or would be treated as such? Obviously, that's a question about identity and perception. It is a twofold question. The second question, and this is a very important qualification of this test, is that one asks oneself, when one is establishing whether there is an objectively based risk in the country of origin, is there a real risk that gay men living openly in the country of origin would be persecuted? So the yardstick by which one measures the risk in the country of origin is not somebody who might be concealing a part of who they are, but it is about risk to all those living openly. Now, obviously, there might be subcategories of people where there isn't a risk to all those living openly, but there is a specific risk to a subcategory. But and then, having established those two questions, one asks the next third question in AJ Iran: how would the claimant behave on return? Would they be open? In which case, they are a refugee, and it doesn't matter that they could conceal themselves and or any part of themselves by and avoid risk by living discreetly. However, if they would not be open, and that means they would conceal some part or everything about themselves, and thereby effectively avoid persecution, then one proceeds to the later part of the test. And I pause there. Next, please. That question is one about not just concealment, that is also about effective concealment. So if the risk remains in spite of the concealment, the claimant is a refugee. And it may be clear that actually the claimant can never avoid persecution, whatever it is they do. They may be known to their persecutors who can't suddenly forget who they are. They therefore will be treated as gay, and we're not talking about the potential engagement of these discretion issues. Or there might be something about them that places them at risk, something about how they are or how they are perceived. And one theme that that comes up in discretion analysis and has come up in both the previous speakers' analysis is obviously where there is a real risk of persecution. Concealment in the long term is unlikely to be successful, and it can't sufficiently remove the risk, especially when one is talking about oppressive societies from sexual or gender identity perspective. There's often no such thing as privacy in order to permit such concealment. Or the effort required to conceal may involve presentation of a heterosexual narrative. Now, the next, please. The next step in analysis is the question of motivation referred to by the previous speakers, and it is then the court, if you are successful in avoiding risk by partial or wholesale concealment, the question is what is the reason for that? And if one of the many reasons, including cultural reasons or family reasons, these are some of the examples given in A.J. Rahn, are those that are related to persecution, or the awareness that there is a risk of persecution and therefore in part you conceal, then you're a refugee. Obviously, from a perspective of a rational analysis, it is very difficult to conceive of a person who is a human being with a sense of self-preservation who would not be influenced, at least, by the real risk of persecutory harm. And that is recognized in A.J. Rahn, that there is no real choice, but most people will have to conceal and will conceal because they will not want to experience what is in truth and objectively based risk of persecution. Next, please. In the UK, A.J. Rahn approach applies to all the refugee claims. That has recently been confirmed in WA Pakistan. And what one sees in the application of A.J. Rahn test and what has been identified in Euclid's research in missing the mark and still falling short is that there are defects in analysis, both at casework level, and this is also sometimes reflected in judicial decision making. The first problem is the misunderstanding of the test in A.J. Rahn. Sometimes caseworkers and also courts think that persecution needs to be the only reason for concealment, while A.J. Rahn shows that it is one among many reasons for concealment. And a common Other problem is that one examines risk on return not in relation to those who live openly, but to those who conceal in their country of origin. And another problem is, of course, the analysis of how one will behave in the future and why they would conceal is based on something they do in the UK and not what they would do if they were in their country of origin where the risk of persecution is present. Now, what we say, next please, is that if one looks at the application of this test and sees it through the lens of challenges, as well as the nature of the test expressed in A.J. Rahn, is that one is led to that question of why one conceals, is really that it is answered presumptively in most cases, and that is the position of UNHCR in the case of Elsie Albania, which was a challenge to A.J. Rahn test based on the reasoning on X, Y, and Z in CJEU. You have heard about X, Y, and Z already, which, depending on how one reads it, either says the same thing as A.J. Rahn or actually says that and on the slide you will see the citation that the Qualification Directive does not require that in assessing the extent of the risk of actual acts of persecution, it is necessary to take into account the possibility of concealment effectively. Now, the UK Court of Appeal said that A.J. Rahn is correct in its entirety, and the interesting point was that UNHCR intervention proposed that, in fact, what one has with A.J. Rahn test is that the fourth question is presumptively answered, and that in most cases you will conceal for objectively founded reason. Now, the problems with application of this test are one matter, and they're a matter of case law. The interesting point from a perspective of casework is that on a conventional refugee convention analysis, which is where one is looking at the predicament of a particular claimant on return to their country, one can find that, for example, a person who has never expressed any part of who they are and may not, on return to their country of origin, express. And when we look at that dichotomy expressed by Jana about being outed and being gay or not being outed, that perspective may actually give us a situation where on A.J. Rahn analysis, a person who's not outed, they are gay, but they have always concealed and will conceal, will actually be afforded protection. Given that A.J. Rahn also applies in cases which are not sexual orientation cases, one can have a similar analysis. The infamous analysis of, say, a political activist who is a low-level activist, and therefore, let's assume on a correct analysis, will not attract persecutory harm or will not be at real risk. And if that is correct, on their particular situation, if as a second tier analysis one applies A.J. Rahn analysis, we might find that they are afforded protection. Similarly, the anonymous blogger, let's assume, who has always been anonymous and continued their anonymous blogging in the country where the refugee status is being determined, when we ask ourselves the question of whether they will be at risk in their country of origin, where their activity and their identity are unknown because their identity remains unknown, but should they come to the attention of a persecutor, they will be at risk. AJ-RAN analysis might more readily produce a protective outcome for that person.
Bojana, I'm afraid we're running out of time.
That is it. Thank you.
Oh, that is it. Okay. All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you. Sorry, I cut you off right before your final words in that case. Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Bojana. Thank you. I think we've heard some 3 very fascinating presentations, all on the same topic, but all approaching it from very different angles.